Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
It's an honor to be invited by the International Association of Counseling to speak today. And I just wanted to thank my colleague, Dr. Martin Buchanan, who preceded us, for giving a very solid foundation of understanding that the five of us can move forward on, and much appreciated, Marla. Thank you. I am Marv Westwood, and as some people indicate from this country, very aware that I work and live on the unceded territories of various Indigenous nations here, and recognize that. In my work in counseling psychology, my interest has always been in the area of group work. So that's what I really focus on a great deal. And so I would probably describe it as working with trauma in groups as a therapeutic modality or a counseling modality. That's me. I get hope from time to time seeing how people can recover from what we call a war-related trauma injury, either in the present or even recover from trauma-related war injuries that happened 1 or 2 generations earlier with their fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, etc. That's the intergenerational piece. Now I would like to just introduce my colleagues who are joining me today. And I'll start with Jürgen Müller-Hohagen, and he's a colleague of mine from Germany, and we work together in understanding how to repair, to dialogue and understand how all of us as adults and children have been impacted in all parts of the world by the effects of war, and hence the title, Long Shadow of War. The other person who you will meet is David Savelle from the United Kingdom, and he and Jürgen, they will talk about how they've worked together with a very interesting project of bringing people from different countries together, the descendants, and we'll discover what they have in common. So David Savelle is here from the UK. The other person I want to indicate is Richard Lefleur, and he's from the United States in West Georgia, and he is particularly skilled and informed in the area of both trauma and intergenerational trauma as it relates to not only Indigenous people, but Black Americans and the heritage and the impact of the slavery in the world. And finally, another colleague of mine from University of British Columbia is Grant Charles. And his interest is in an area that Marla has been talking about, is early childhood and young adults, and the case or the understanding of what happens to children in care. In North America, in care means often institutionalized or maybe taken away, and he will explain that. I will just conclude now by saying we are just giving preview presentations. We have about 15 minutes, maybe we'll have 17, I'm not sure, but we're just giving a preview of our interest in contributing more fully in our approaches for counseling approaches at the next IAC conference of 2022. Really looking forward to joining. So I'll begin my presentation now. And the person who's helping us in our presentations is Jeffrey Feng. And so Jeffrey, can you connect us up? You have all the presentation slides and on your side. So I'm ready to begin. Yes, well, and you can see the image of the long shadow of wars, not just war. The long shadow of wars comes from the fact that when tragedies happen, and they're happening all the time in the world, they have in the past, they're occurring now, and there's a shadow when the war is over that goes into the first and second and third generation and so on. So that's why the image, and thank you for that, Jeffrey. Next. There's the title, notice the long shadows of wars, they're plural, all right? And I will just give acknowledgement, the signage there, called the IVET, it's the Institute for Veteran Education and Transition at UBC. We're engaged there in an initiative at the university to encourage returning veterans to enter post-secondary institutions like ours and others in Canada, to explore and expand career options and to contribute to our society the knowledge that veterans bring back to this country when they serve overseas, and the respect that we learn for the citizens of these other parts of the world that they often work with, but not in a military capacity. Often what they're doing is helping people with school programs, water projects, food, and all sorts of other areas. And most North Americans don't really get a chance to learn about on the ground what that involves, but the veterans are transporters of information. Next. Okay, that title Marla has already introduced and explained very well, so we'll just move on. I don't have to, and I'm so thankful the way she did it. Next. I would just say the effects of war-related intergenerational traumas is I'm taking something from Bessel van der Kolk, and he describes most traumas are actually a normal reaction to an abnormal event. And why that's important is when working with our clients, when they have PTSD, as was articulated in their former presentation, sometimes people are confused or they did something wrong, or if the trauma comes from childhood, they think there's something wrong with them. It's abnormal to be distressed like this, but no, when they come to understand in the counseling process, your experience now to a trauma injury is a normal reaction to an abnormal event, whether that's war or sexual assault or physical assault or abandonment. Next. This is I think a 1-minute clip, which is helpful. It's Rachel Yehuda, because I kind of followed her work originally. So do you want to run that then, Jeffrey? If it doesn't play, Jeffrey, we can go on to the next slide. Are you there, Jeffrey? Yeah. Sound?
Like Yehuda's, suggests parental life experiences can modify their body chemistry, and those modifications can be transmitted to children as well. Scientists have examined this idea before. After a famine in Holland during 1944 and 45, children were born with the effects of malnutrition 2 generations after the food shortage ended. Previously, Yehuda herself studied stress hormone levels in children born to women who survived the September 11th terrorist attacks. She's been examining the link between trauma experienced by Holocaust survivors and their children for more than 20 years.
A trauma is an event that changes you, and it doesn't have to change you for the negative. Trauma changes you in lots of different ways, but most people who experience extreme trauma learn a great deal from that experience. And some of those lessons may be lessons that are transmitted to the child, and that's not a bad thing.
Yehuda says the implications aren't limited to Holocaust survivors.
Let's
this
begin
dwindled
there.
population provides.
Thank you. Next slide. So what can we do to help reduce or diminish the impact of war-related intergenerational trauma? It's one thing to understand that there's an intergenerational effect that's passed on, but how do we help adults who are the children of people who are war traumatized, and then the grandchildren, because the epigenetics suggests that there may be a sensitivity that's passed on, but this system can be interrupted. Also, please understand, when people recover from trauma injuries and understand trauma, it's not all bad, because there's something called traumatic growth. When we complete therapy, some of the clients come out understanding, yeah, it was hell, it was difficult, but they learned strategies and resilience and survival. So when I work with veterans returning in the trauma recovery, or with adult children of veterans, we talk about what's happened to you is understandable. And as Wolfen says in his research, he says, it's this, the title of one of his books, it didn't start with you. So the effects, maybe your stressors that you're having in life and you're struggling a generation later, is understandable given what happened to the parents that you had following that epigenetic pathway. But let me go back to what we can do and what we have tried here. And that's called a group-based life review. This is for the adult children or grandchildren of parents who were traumatized in one or two different wars. Okay, next. So that's the image. We meet together as a group. Marla talked about creating safety. What we do in a group, these are adults together. They would be imagined to be getting ready to understand themselves and in light of their parents' experience. But you build safety first. In a group context, there's a lot of direct contact, support, and creation of safety, and then they can get down to work. Next one. What is the group-based life review? What does it involve? It's actually very accessible because it involves writing, telling, and integrating one's personal story. So we have a plan that they prepare before they come to the group, a writing about some of their thoughts with focus questions. Next. Once they have written something, they then are asked to reflect on it, articulate, which means talk about it, and ultimately share their own narrative by the person who lived it. So they would talk about their own growing up. They would read their story into the group about their experiences living with a trauma-injured parent from a war zone. Next. Members that are there as witnesses, and they listen and they respond to the speaker, the reader of the story. So it's an interactive modality. So it's not just writing, reading, speaking, it's listening and then being witnessed and having others respond. Next. The responding by the witnesses to the stories often reveals that as the adult children of war-injured veterans, they will actually discover that other people in the group have similar experiences to them, that they're not alone. So normalization and cohesion and support begins to emerge in the group, and that's the therapeutic process. Next. Important thing here in this session this morning, I won't articulate how we can do this. We don't have the time, but we'll be doing that in the next conference, is how you set up groups for trauma recovery in intergenerational trauma. But you need, it's structured and you need a guided professional facilitator. But that's often counselors, and they're very well prepared with additional training to run these groups. Next. Ultimately then, this group approach gives greater understanding of how their life, that is the individual's life, has been shaped by being raised by a veteran parent. And it gives them not only understanding, but often releases some shame because they often feel guilty. Many of the adult children of people in war will carry the history of the war, and they will take on a sense of stigma and shame, which had nothing to do with them. And this kind of group actually helps release that kind of attribution. Next. The two core themes, just so you get an idea, is that they write and prepare and speak about becoming aware of dad's or grandfather's wartime experience. And in one of our groups, because we ran a group for men and a group for women, adult women, some of them had mothers that served in the war as well, and so grandmothers would apply. But they're the sons and daughters, or the grandsons and granddaughters of the people who served in the military or were war injured. And then the biggest focus, of course, in this group is in sharing with others. What's the impact on you of having been raised with a veteran parent? Next. Another group-based scene, you can see the members interacting, they're small groups, and they can work very quickly and effectively. Next. Now let's hear, as we close, from two of the participants. They were asked, what did you get out of participating in the Intergenerational Trauma Awareness Group? So let's hear from Sandra.
Well, I have deep gratitude for being able to share my story, which I was always a little bit wary of because my father is not Canadian, well he is now, but he fought on the German side. So I never felt that I could share my stories. And so in this group, I was able to tell my story. There was no judgment. I was heard. And while I thought my story was, really different, it turns out it's not. That we all have the same issues, we have the same feelings, we experienced very similar things. So my story is not unique.
Just last comment before we look at the next person. Sandra indicated also it's the first time in her life that she felt totally free to tell the full story of her parent, because at that time in history, her father was in the military, who was in adversarial relationship to the ones of her father, of the other group members' fathers, but they found out they had much more in common than different. So the last one, let's listen to the next participant's response to what he was aware of in the group.
Well,
no, the next one. Yeah, there it is. Thank you, George.
Again, to the day my father died, he never shook my hand. Because to me, that's a symbol of you're a man, you're equal, and he would never shake my hand. And he must have said he loved me when I was small. I don't remember, but he never said that up to the day he died. So that kind of frozen emotion that he had. With theirs, where we've gone the opposite with, it's like, I have my son, he's just turned 33, and my daughter's 36, and my son in the middle of a mall, when we say goodbye, I get a big hug from him and everything else. I never got that with my father, and we did that with our kids, and
you changed that,
and intentionally changed that, so that they would know that we loved them, that we know that we can be open with each other and talk about issues and stuff.
You can see there, that's very good evidence of what was presented in the earlier session, how if the parent is traumatized, the ability to form safe relationships with their children is often absent, and the sons and daughters then grow up with kind of an avoidant parent, which affects them, and he's aware of that. And in the group, he's talking about that awareness has helped him understand how he's changed that cycle and his attachment and connection to his own adult children. So that gives you a glimpse, a bit of a sample of some of their experiences. And I want to say that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to introduce, I believe it's David Savelle. David,
very much. Thank you very much, Marv. Can I just check that people can hear me? Can you put your hand up if you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real honour to be with you all today, and really fantastic to be part of this presentation with Marv and Richard and Grant and with Jürgen. So I'm David Savelle. I'm the Artistic Director of the UK charity Age Exchange. We were founded in '83, and the charity specialises in reminiscence arts practice, which is used to measurably improve well-being for older people, the older people we support in residential care homes, hospitals, And we work to give all the people a voice in society and to enable them to express their lived experience through the therapeutic practice of the arts and reminiscence. At our centre in London, we run services and projects supporting older people, including those with dementia and with Alzheimer's and with physical disability. And we also support family and professional carers through a very wide-ranging training programme. And much of our work, however, is delivered in care. I'm going to focus on just one very particular area that relates to our long shadows theme. I joined the charity in 1998 and have worked for the last 20 odd years in care homes in the UK. And I wanted to just say that in my 20 plus years of working in care homes, I was doing the math, and I cannot think of one care home that I've worked in where at some stage an older person, a person in their 80s, 90s, and even in their hundreds, has not shared a memory of war. A memory of being evacuated as children during the Blitz, a memory of Dunkirk or Normandy, a memory of the Holocaust, a memory of growing up under British imperial rule. In every care home, hospital and hospice that we have worked in, war has always been present. Its impact across the generations, its impact on the children of those who were directly affected it and passed down through the generations, its long shadow. And we have always given space and time to all those who wanted to talk about it, to express it, to pass it on, and sometimes even to express their war story through the medium of the arts, whether that was music, whether that was dance, role play, or visual arts. I'm going to leap forward to an anniversary, a commemoration, because in 2014, Britain prepared to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And this was a really a huge thing in my country. It became apparent to me, I was involved in quite a few projects around the commemoration of the First World War with all sorts of different organisations, theatres, football clubs, museums, art galleries, care homes, schools, and so on. Of the 400 projects that were supported by our Heritage Lottery programme, by the year 2016, not one of those projects was a collaborative project with Germany. And for me, as someone married into a German family who's seen the impact of war on both sides of the family, the omission of an Anglo-German collaboration marking this huge centenary was unacceptable and actually very worrying as well. What worried me was that we were left only with the narrative of victory, and militaristic ritual was uncomfortable. And for many who saw this period as an opportunity for reconciliation and healing, this seemed to be missing. I'm going to just summarise a remarkable meeting that happened, which was with an Austrian, Elfriede Pauli, who came to our centre in Aid Exchange. We'd previously worked in dementia projects together. And I had a conversation with Elfriede about what was happening with the commemoration of the First World War in Germany, and she said nothing. And so we looked at a potential commemorative project that we could do, bringing German and British elders, that's direct descendants of those who had fought in the First World War or experienced the First World War, together. And for the next 18 months, Elfriede, with my support, she tried repeatedly to drum up interest for a project with Aid Exchange in Bavaria. She was turned down by universities, she was turned down by museums, she was turned down by multiple funders. Her breakthrough actually came, ironically, with her own next door neighbour, the wonderful Rainer, who sadly has passed away now. He went up into his attic in his house and he found a diary. The diary had belonged to his mother. She had kept it as a young girl in her, I think she was 12 when she started writing in this diary, and she had kept it for 3 years between 1914 and 1917. And the diary included all of her observations as a child of the impact that the First World War had had on her neighbours and on her family in her small town in Hanover. And this extraordinary finding set a process, because Elfriede then spoke to a friend at Bavarian Radio, And this friend who was a newsreader said, well, let's set up readings of the diary live on air. This happened, and there was a lot of people called in, and gradually a group of German First World War descendants came together and met. And at the same time, Age Exchange also came across another wonderful project, Münchener Bildungswerk, and Jürgen, who's going to speak after me, Jürgen, Karen and Melanie, who were engaged in a really remarkable project, which was called The Long Shadows of the War, which I'm sure Jürgen will talk about. So this group of like-minded organizations, British and German, with similar values, came together. And we had in mind one thing. We wanted to bring together descendants to meet face-to-face, to bring together artifacts, family memorabilia, archive memorabilia, and to meet face-to-face and to have 4 days in a very safe space where they could have time as a group, time one-to-one, time doing all kinds of different activities, therapeutic activities, but ultimately sharing the impact that the First World War had on their fathers and mothers, grandfathers and grandmothers, but also across the generations on their family. Jeffrey, are you happy to move to the next slide, please? Okay, and on to the next one. That's great. The one off, that's it. Thank you very much. So just briefly, where do we start with a project like this? I always felt that whatever happened should happen in Germany. That's a hard one to explain. It was perhaps just an instinct, but I kind of felt that Britain, which was at that time very deep into the commemorative celebrations almost of the First World War, that whatever we did, it should be a question of taking British descendants to Germany and being in their home and in their town where they felt at home. So that's what we planned for. The project leaders met in Rosenheim in January 2016. I remember it was snowing. I also remember that large numbers of refugees were arriving from Syria and other countries into Rosenheim, which was had white tents all along where the railways were, and that was our context for a discussion about the First World War, but looking actually at the current trauma that was going on in the present day. The meeting, what we wanted to do was really project leaders to use ourselves as guinea pigs and explore what kind of activities we would do when we brought these older descendants together. And we had a really extraordinary 2 days. One very simple thing was to look at the use of memory triggers, the use of family artifacts, letters, diaries, in some cases uniform. And we asked each project leader to bring an artifact that related to their own family history of the First World War. And this sharing between us was something that we knew we then wanted to do with the descendants. It was an extremely powerful thing. We could see our own ancestors connected in the past, but we could also make connections between ourselves in the present. And there were other lovely ideas. Hannah Kircher, the German artist, also a descendant taking part, she said that she would like to run art classes for descendants, art sessions for descendants, so that they could paint or draw a picture that represented their relationship with their ancestor, their mother, their father, and that symbolized their relationship and the link to the war, and also first, but also to the Second World War. Hannah and Karen and Melanie wanted us to visit a German war memorial in order to understand how difficult it is in Germany for remembrance of the war to take place at all. And this is something that we all agreed to do, and that was a particularly powerful day. And one of the other things we agreed to was Hannah's idea was that each descendant would make a dog tag with their father or grandfather's name, their regiment, whatever, and that we would then create one huge chain, interweaving all the British and German dog tags together in I think it was a 20-meter chain. A very difficult task for our filmmaker, the wonderful Ivan Riches, who was going to get to film these exchanges of all the descendants when they met, effectively in one take. And so eventually we managed to bring everyone together in Rosenheim in April 2016, and the nerves were frayed, the anticipation, we were all very nervous. We had prepared, we had prepared to make sure that this was a very safe experience, structured experience, but we were still all very, very nervous. And I remember all of the descendants sitting together and waiting for the beginning of our meeting in no man's land, which began with a question from me, which was very simple: why are you here? And as Jürgen told me later, when he recorded his German narration for the film, this question created a space for us all. It was the thing that we were all asking ourselves as descendants. It was what was inside our heads. I'm only going to give literally, I think it's just 4 or 5 tiny answers here. It's irrelevant as to whether these were German or British answers. I'm here to reclaim my grandfather from oblivion. He would want me to be here. If my father could see me now with the descendants of his enemies, what would he think? I am here because I'm curious. I believe there is more that unites us than divides us. I'm here because I don't ever want what happened to my father to happen to future generations. I'm going to stop there and show a piece of film. I hope that's okay. There were all kinds of activities over these days of being together. One of them was what we called the paired interviews, where we created 12 pairings where one German descendant and one British descendant spent an hour together through an interpreter where needed, not in the case we're about to show you, and where they got to share their family story and to show their family artifacts and so on from the war to each other. And these were really powerful exchanges and meetings. This one is between Ruth, who's now in her early 90s, Linda in her late 80s. Their fathers fought on opposite sides at the Second Battle of Ypres, and I thought you'd like to see this exchange because to me it was remarkable. Jeffrey, if you're happy to play the first piece of film. That's the top one, I think. Thank you.
1 second, I'm loading it up.
Ruth, I think you.
You okay there, Jeffrey?
Ruth, I think your father and my father, they.
Is it me or is it them?
Are you okay to press play?
They have been at the same place in the war. In Ypres.
Ypres, absolutely, yes, they were indeed. Oh my goodness, yes. But and this is your father, is it?
Yes, it's my father.
Right.
Before he went to the war, he had a last photograph for his parents because he did not know if he will come back.
No,
Yes.
oh no. He looks so young there.
Yes, I say it's a boy.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
think in those times, the childhood was much more longer than today.
Well, yes, indeed.
If I look at my grandson and so, I think they are earlier grown up.
Yeah, they have, yes. Well, this is my father. I don't think this was taken at Ypres, but there he is. There are 2 of him. So
Yeah.
see him. He wasn't very tall, as you can see, but
He wasn't tall.
so they were both small.
But he had a much beautiful cap. That's not.
Oh, I like that one.
No. The British Army gave them better hats.
Oh, right, yes.
That's why they won the war,
Yes,
maybe.
yeah. But between the pair of them, look at all that destruction. I mean, it's appalling, isn't it? Really, the destruction of the houses and everything.
They had this house to put in die Granaten.
The grenades.
Yes.
Mines.
In the
Mines in the
cellar.
garden.
Oh, in the cellar, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and then a bomb fall into the house, and all that exploded.
Oh my goodness.
And there were 10, he writes, 10 men down in the cellar, and they could not bring them out because it was filled with water after that.
Oh,
so
yeah.
this is the card he wrote to his parents.
Yes.
Also Bombenschlösschen in Händekot. Ich kann es nicht ganz gut lesen, das Wort. Wo ich ja auch lag. Drinnen war im Keller unsere Kaffeeküche. Vor 3 Wochen hat ein Volltreffer die im Keller lagernden Handgranaten entzündet und circa 10 Mann kamen im Keller um und liegen noch drinnen, da der Keller von hereinströmendem Wasser angefüllt ist. Did he later on write letters to you? Do you have some?
Oh no, he died when I was 4. So
yeah,
so no, I haven't. So that's why these are so precious. But this is one that I really like because he says, "I'm still in the same dugout that we are going forward today. The place is absolutely filled with lovely roses. The smell of them is delicious. I shall indeed be sorry to leave them and enclose you one of the buds, so you shall have some small share of their beauties, though I fear it will be dead before it reaches you." This is near the end of the war, yes.
Yes, and he was hurt.
Was he?
Okay, Jeffrey, we could stop there.
And so.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to overrun my time. Those are 2 remarkable women, and I would just say that the film Meeting in No Man's Land is available, and I'm really happy to send you a link to it if anyone's particularly interested in it. There's so much I could say about the project. It was supposed to finish in 2016, but really it's still going on today, and it's had a very big impact on the people who took part in it. Linda and Ruth, for example, have formed a very, very close friendship. Many of the descendants are learning each other's languages, they write to each other, they send chocolate to each other, and those friendships have remained very, very strong throughout Brexit and now throughout the pandemic, and we are also looking at another project in the future. But the project was supposed to be a history project, but it became very much about reconciliation across 100 years, reconciliation for their dead ancestors, reconciliation for themselves, and it was very much a healing experience. So I shall leave it there and mute myself, and I think I'm handing over to my friend Richard Lefleur. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's up to me. No, okay, I'm Jürgen Müller-Hohagen, not Richard Lefleur. And I'm a German psychologist, psychotherapist. I have been working a lot in the field of counseling. I've been the head of a family counseling institution in Munich for 25 years. And I have experiences in counseling and psychotherapy with a psychoanalytic background, but family therapy as well has been so important for me. Okay, in 1982 there happened something very important. We had to move away from Munich, our very beloved city, to another place which is called Dachau. We had lost our flat in Munich, and my wife and me, we asked, oh, shall we go there into this small town and with this special past? We did it, and then we said, and then we will study more about this special history. We knew something about it, of course, but it became a very intense time, and for me, something like a new formation analysis, but not on the couch, but with survivors of the camp and with investigators of the local and the German history. That was very, very important. And then I found out that in my normal work, normal in citation dots, that in a certain institution, if I asked people, clients, something about, not only about the last 10 years, but about the wartime and after war. Then it came to the light that there were so many, many important details and connections to the problems why they came today with their children who were handicapped in that institution, which was specialized on it. And I found out I have to ask and I have to overcome my own denial and repression and the denial of my profession, because in my studies of psychology, I never heard anything about the impact of Nazi time and World War II, neither in my psychoanalytical formation. And so Dachau became a very, very important place for me and for my wife, who is a teacher and head of a school, of a Montessori school for many years. So that's my background. And now I have been working in this field for more than 35 years, not in the center, but as a very important part of my normal work. Okay. Can you show the next slide, Jeffrey? Okay. And the long shadows of what? Now this. This is Per Göransson, a self-portrait of him. He's or he was, unfortunately, he was a Swedish painter. We got to know him in Italy, our common second home country, in a small village where he has been living for a long time. And we met him several times. And look, this is a very nice portrait, impressive, well done. Okay, and then, and it was typical for peaceful pictures, flowers, as you can see here, or this portrait, or landscapes or architecture. Very good done. Okay. And then I think it was in 94, we entered his studio and we were stuck for surprise. May I have the next slide? Oh no, this is again one of these peaceful pictures, olive trees, some light and so on. The next one, please. Oh, and this, suddenly this. What was it? That's a general commanding war, or maybe a dictator producing war. And then besides it, the next slide, please. This one. Wow. What do you want to say? A dead head, a skull. What is it? How did you come to produce these pictures? We asked him. He a Swedish man, he had not been touched by the war. He had been born, I think, in 35. They did not have to do anything with the war, not directly, of course. And why did you make it? And I never forget his answer. It was my brush. And he could not explain it, but he had to paint these pictures. And I had to buy them. And it's very difficult to show them, but yeah, but I bought them for today. Okay. Yeah, and so I want to demonstrate how war invades lives, even of a person from this rather peaceful Sweden. And we talked a lot about this in Italy and in Dachau when he visited us, and in Oslo and in Sweden as well. When we visited him and his wife, we were very good friends then. And what you can learn about these two pictures, or by these pictures, is the logics of war are very, very simple. Black and white, as you see here, black and white, binary. And winners and losers, death and life, us and them, and the propaganda of the good, us, and the evil, the others. Those are the logics. Very, very simple. But to suffer war, that's a very different thing. And what I want to explain only in a few lines is just for looking at the German history and this horrible history of World War II and Holocaust. I must say, we have a past not only of this war, it's a past of wars in the plural. To delineate it only in a few lines, there has been the relatively normal, in citation brackets, dots, of course, the relatively normal war of the soldiers in the West against France and UK. The completely ruthless war of the soldiers in the East, just a very different war. And the war of extermination waged by the SS and by the soldiers or by soldiers of the Wehrmacht against the Jews and other so-called subhumans. And the war in the concentration camps on the so-called inner front against all people opposed by the Nazis. And then we have to think about the suffering of the war in the defeated countries, suffering the crimes in the defeated countries, suffering the crimes on the side of the persecuted people. And in the end, not to forget, but it's difficult to bring it together, the suffering of the bomb war, flight and expulsion on the part of the German civilian population. So, pondering about psychological consequences. The next slide, please. Pondering about the shadows of those wars. Experiences from Germany, I can report only a little bit of them. Only a few seconds. What do you think about? Which are your experiences personally or in your country? We are connected here all over the world. What is it? The psychological aftermath. Okay, and then what are you expecting from the expert who is talking here, from 35 years of experience? Next slide, please. It's this. I thought about how could a picture be done to show the effects or something of the effects of wars, of those wars I called of wars in general. No, it's impossible to produce, to put it into a picture, to symbolize it. And so I have put here some question dots. And they are very typical for my work. People come to me now, after having retired, it's my main focus. They come to me in my private practice, as I did just before as well, because of backgrounds of that Nazi period and World War II. But, and that's so different. And it depends so much on what has been the background. Have ancestors been persecuted? Have they been soldiers or even SS men? Has there been expulsion? Have ancestors experienced flight? and so on. That's very, very different. And so I must explain it only on one point. There's often been quoted, yes, there has been much silence in the families, and parents did not talk about the past. And so, and that has been the common situation in the families of persecuted persons and in the families of perpetrators. Okay, that's right. There has been a lot of silence, but it's a fundamental difference on the other side. On one hand, there was silence because people who had been persecuted and tortured, they could not talk about it. They could not. And they could not talk about it to their children. It was impossible to do it in an adequate manner. What is adequate then? And on the other side, perpetrators or bystanders, they did not talk about what they have done or what they have seen and allowed, or that they had voted for Hitler before the rise of the Third Reich and all this. And so you see, that's very different. The same silence is not the same. Okay. I think that's, yeah. And then we are talking about trauma. I cannot do it here, but anymore. You have heard something about it, very important information. But there is another dimension, at least in Germany, but and in a very special way, but in other countries as well, there's a dimension of guilt. What, and this is the big question for the descendants. What has my father, what has my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, what have they done? And what have they silenced after? But I feel there is something in my mind, in my soul, but I can't discriminate it. And this is a very difficult, very important work I do. Okay, then only a few words, the next slide, please, about the special importance of counseling, because this is a Congress on counseling. I have been working in both fields, counseling and psychotherapy. And it's only a thesis here. I think I made the experience in the field of counseling, it was easier to come to these backgrounds, to come to these topics, easier than in psychotherapy for several reasons. For example, because of the cooperation with the social services, with medical field. And so you must know in Munich, I have always been working in Munich, which is very close to Dachau. And I think there are inhabitants of more than 180 countries. And in my work, not in the therapeutical work so much, but in the counseling work. And when I went to a creche, to a kindergarten, to have counseling there, then I came into contact with so many backgrounds of the crises of the world, of boat people from Vietnam, of people, the Uyghurs from China just many years ago, the war in former Yugoslavia. They did not come to psychotherapy, but they came to bring their child into a creche, into the kindergarten. And then we could talk about something, as you have been heard and been discussed. And as I think Anna Suya has spoken about working in these crises. in a crisis. So well. Okay, I finish, and I want to show you the next slide. Yes, this is a picture of Per Göransson as well. It is on love. And you see, it's so differentiated. It's so complex, so fine. You can reflect on it for hours. And this is life. This is real life. This is the contrary of war and wars. And so I want to share it with you. And this is what we have to live if we want the earth to be filled by human beings, even in the future, and not an earth without us, because we have killed each other in an atomic war or what else. Okay, next slide. Yeah, what can we learn? We can learn to live love, to live complex situations, to recognize how life is complex. And this is the title of a book I have been writing now together with my dear wife, Dialogue Instead of Trauma, or Instead of Producing Trauma. I think this is a very big impact for our future. Okay, and then, so I say thank you for enduring these topics, not only of my presentation, but of this just evening or morning, or yeah. And in the end, I can say there has been so much friendship emerging in this wonderful project, which David has been spoken of, and it was so amazing, and it moved me so much hearing him, and just in this World Congress. Okay, bye-bye.
Jürgen, let me first say thank you for such a moving presentation, and also to my colleague David and to Mar for laying such a great foundation. A few words just about myself real quick. My name is Dr. Lefleur. I reside close to the city of Atlanta, Georgia, and I am a researcher and instructor at the University of West Georgia. And a lot of my work revolves around the reconciliation process of veterans when they return from being deployed. But my work also revolves around the topic of social justice and how we can bring reconciliation to social justice. And a couple words that stuck out from our presentation thus far today: suffering and war, pain, persecution, inhumane, silence, and reconciliation. And today I want to share with you a project that I'm working on that has to do with the long shadow of war, a different type of war, needless to say, it's still a war. Here in the United States, we are in a very state of division, and that division comes on many fronts. But today I want to really just address two marginalized groups of people here in the US for the sake of time. And within these groups, we can see the lasting effects of war, and it's felt from generation to generation. But what's interesting is the lasting effects are present today in our society. Jürgen, you gave a great summary at the end, and I want to pick up when you left off with love. And in The Phenomenon of Man, Desjardins writes, the outcome of the world, the gates of the future, the entry into the superhuman, these are not thrown open for a few of the privileged, nor the one chosen people to the exclusion of others. They will open to an advance altogether in a direction which altogether can join and find completion in a spiritual revolution of the earth, a renovation whose physical degree of reality we must now consider. And the words of this thinker really helps me understand that we've reached a point where in order for us to continue to develop and to love, we must grow together in humanity. And as I survey this thought, it seems as though that there are moments in history where we were not all together. We weren't growing together. So the first marginalized group that I want to bring to your attention is the Black American. And again, this is a project that I'm just now getting off the ground. So I'm going to give you a little historical context as to why this is important and how we're seeing it play out in real time. In American history, the plight of the Black American has been riddled by an ongoing war, and the effects are still experienced in culture today. The civil rights movement is a continuation of the Civil War. The civil rights movement was a struggle for social justice, a cry for Black Americans to be seen as 100% human beings. It took place mainly during the 1950s and 60s, so notice how far back we've gone now, with the premise to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. And Jeffrey, you can move to slide number 1. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against Black people. Slide number 2. Black Americans continue to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South, which was dehumanizing and contained many elements of trauma, both personal and collective. By the mid-20th century, many Black Americans suffered enough prejudice and violence against them. Slide number 3. They, along with many white Americans, they began to mobilize and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned for 2 decades. Slide number 4. One of the most influential leaders and moments in history that led to the civil rights movement, and that was the Jim Crow laws. And you notice here a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he was one of those pioneers, along with John Lewis, to sort of really revolutionize the thinking. But it came with resistance. In the early 1830s, there was a white actor. His name was Thomas Dartmouth. He was nicknamed Daddy Rice. And he was propelled to stardom for his performance as a fictional character called Jim Crow, as a character of a clumsy, dim-witted Black enslaved man. Rice appropriated the Jim Crow persona as a minstrel act where he donned blackface and performed jokes and songs in a stereotypical demeaning dialect. Rice's act proved to be a massive hit among white audiences, and he later took it on tour around the United States and Great Britain. As part of the show, it became very popular. It became the Jim Crow show, but it was used in a very derogatory way, and it became a term that was derogatory towards Black people. Jim Crow's popularity as a fictional character eventually died out in the late 19th century. But the phrase found new life as a blanket term for a wave of anti-Black laws laid down during the Reconstruction period. Some of those most common laws included a restriction on voting rights. Many Southern states required literacy tests, limited suffrage for those whose grandfathers who also had a right to vote, and they were denied that right to vote. Next slide, Jeffrey. Other laws banned interracial relationships while causing businesses to separate their Black and white clientele. The segregationist philosophy of separate but equal was later upheld in the famous 1896 Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the court ruled that in the state of Louisiana, they had the right to require different railroad cars for Blacks and for whites. The Plessy decision would eventually lead to a widespread adoption of segregated restaurants, public bathrooms, water fountains, and other facilities. Separate but equal was eventually overturned, but Jim Crow's legacy would continue to endure in the South for many decades. And we can even still see that in that way of thinking present in many aspects of our society today. Today, we are still experiencing the effects of separate but equal in our society. Many Black Americans do not feel equal to white Americans. More recently, the protests and march against discrimination led to organizations such as Black Lives Matter to be the forefront of community. Next slide, Jeffrey. And I'm sure you guys have seen these signs all over, when protests were happening last year. And just to just add a little caveat, this was on the heel of George Floyd when he lost his life at the knee of a police officer. So now there was a discrimination between the power structure that's in place, as well as the history of segregation that sort of culminated in that moment in Minnesota. Many Black Americans still feel the weight of voter suppression, the trauma of violence committed against the forefathers, and live under the umbrella of poverty and social unrest, and a plethora of devastating circumstances. Now, while I can spend more time on this topic, I must move on because there's another population that I need to address today. So not only do Black Americans experience the long shadows of war, secondly, so too does the Native American community. Next slide, Jeffrey. Many Native Americans are experiencing the lingering traumas from past generations. Compared with all other racial groups, Native American adults are at a greater risk of experiencing feelings of psychological distress, are more likely to have poorer overall physical and mental health, and unmet medical and psychological needs. The suicide rate for Native American youth and adults are higher than our national average, with suicide being the second leading cause of death for Native Americans between the ages of 10 and 34. Given that there are approximately 566 federally recognized tribes located in 35 states, 60% of Native Americans in the United States, they all reside in urban areas. There is much diversity within the Native American population. So it's definitely difficult to make overall generalizations regarding this population. Next slide, Jeffrey. But still, Native American individuals are reported as having the lowest income, least education, and highest level of poverty of any group, majority or minority in the United States. Next slide. And the lowest life expectancy of any other population in the United States. So to explain why some Native American and Black American individuals are subjected to substantial difficulties, we must turn to the literature of the Jewish Holocaust, because history helps us understand our past and the Jewish Holocaust survivors and their descendants, which is why this project is so important. And the pioneered concept of historical trauma. Next slide, Jeffrey. The current problems facing Native and Black American people today may be the result of a legacy of chronic trauma and unresolved grief across generations, enacted on them by a dominant culture. The primary feature of historical trauma is that the trauma is transferred to subsequent generations through biological, psychological, environmental, and social needs, resulting in a cross-generational cycle of trauma. Specifically, there has been a lack of research on how the past atrocities suffered by Black and Native American people and how it's connected with the current problems within the respective communities. So it is my intent with this project to examine the theoretical framework of historical trauma and apply recent research regarding the impact of trauma on individual psychological functioning and cross-generational transmission of trauma. So I will close with this statement from my opening quote. They will open to an advance of all together, in a direction altogether, can find the completion in a spiritual revolution of earth. And as Jürgen just said, through dialogue, through support, through togetherness. And as we look through the projects that we have going on with inside of the long shadows of wars, maybe we can look back and say, that will allow us to find some understanding and healing. And as this project gets off the ground, it may be a way to bring reconciliation so we can end the suffering between Native Americans and Black Americans of America. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Grant.
Hello, Richard. That was absolutely wonderful. The other ones too. Thank you. I'm Grant Charles. I'm teaching the School of Social Work at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and I'm an affiliate member of the Division of Adolescent
Dr.
Health and
Grant,
Medicine.
can you please speak closer to the mic? You're very soft.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. A member of the Division of Adolescent Health and Medicine in the Faculty of Medicine at UBC. Can I go to the first slide, please, Jeffrey? And this presentation, this short presentation is going to be called Pebbles in the Pond, Trauma Across Space and Time. And to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a model that a colleague and I have developed. We developed it initially to explain student-to-student abuse in the Indian residential school in Canada. And we're trying to look at the impact of trauma both over space and time and how that plays out today, even though these schools have been closed for coming on to 20 years now. But I've also recently started to apply it in other situations. So I want to talk a little bit about a community I lived in when I was a child. My father was a professional soldier. He fought in the Second World War and the Korean War. And I grew up on military bases until my early adolescence. So one of the bases I lived on was called Fort Churchill in Churchill, Manitoba, which is in the subarctic on the Hudson Bay. It was a joint Canadian and US military base. I won't get into the purposes of it, but it's been closed for a number of years now. Churchill, the army base itself was quite isolated, and it was about 2,000 people living there. The only way into it was either by airplane or by a 2-day train ride from the nearest city. Most people couldn't afford the airplane, so people came in by the train, but even that was expensive. So most people, once they were there, didn't leave until they were transferred again. The summers were quite short. And because it's the Arctic, the winters were quite harsh. It wasn't unusual for the weather to get to 40 or 50 below zero. It was above the tree line, so there were no trees growing there. And people know it today because it's most of the pictures of polar bears in Canada come out of Churchill. The demographics of it is many of the military that were there had fought in either the Second World War or the Korean War. Some of them had been peacekeepers. That was early days of peacekeeping for the UN. I lived there in the 1960s, early 1960s. So I'm going to give this description from my memory as a child. I'm not going to talk a lot about what I saw there, but what I did see, my father was a sergeant major on the base, and one of his jobs was to arrange for the transportation of people that died there back to their home communities, wherever that was. And so I had this unique perspective of, as a child, of getting to hear about people dying on the base and how they died. And what struck me at the time, and even more so as an adult, is there was a very high rate of suicide, especially among the men who were in their late 30s to early 50s. So they would have been the combat vets for sure. There's very high rates of substance abuse and family violence, mental health issues, and then high rates of violence in the community, lots of bullying in the schools. And of course, as a child, that just all seemed normal to me. It was just the way things were. But I want you to have this image of this self-contained, relatively small community where there wasn't a lot of outside influence other than new people coming in. But the new people coming in would have just been replacing similar people who were leaving. So my colleague, Dr. Mike DeGagne, and I have developed, as I said, this model to try to conceptualize the impact of lateral violence and the causes of lateral violence in Indigenous communities and student-to-student abuse that happened in the residential schools. But I'm going to describe it now using war and trauma related to war. So imagine a pond. It's a relatively small pond. If we could go to the next picture, please, Jeffrey. It's a relatively small pond. Just to let you know, I took that picture of the polar bear about 5 years ago when I was in Churchill for my first visit in 40 years, I guess it was 30 some odd years. And this is a picture just in the city I live in here I took. But imagine this pond, and there's distinct walls, edges to the pond. It's not large. And if you can imagine that trauma is experienced by an individual is like dropping a pebble in the middle of the pond. It's just a pebble, but there's still ripples that come out of it. So the first ripple, the first line of ripples coming out are what the trauma has done to the individual. So post-traumatic stress, other mental health issues, self-destructive behavior, substance misuse, rage, violence, all of that. The second pebble, as it radiates out from the initial drop, is the impact on the immediate family, whoever's living with that veteran, the person who's been traumatized. So there can be physical violence, psychological violence, emotional violence and neglect, belittling, a lack of sense of safety because of the behavior triggered by the trauma. The next wave that's going out, the next ripples are the impact on extended family and friends in the workplace. So the initial trauma, that person, say, gets into raging, and that would impact anybody that comes into contact with them. Then the ripple goes out further, and it's about the impact on the immediate community. So when you have a community made up of people that have been traumatized, they're interacting with each other dictates the safety of the community, the sense of security of the community, the consideration of what's normal in the community. In a community full of people with rage becomes a norm. It's not seen as an abnormal thing. It's seen as something quite normal. And then the ripples keep going out, and ultimately they have an impact on the greater society. And then another ripple that has an impact on the values and attitudes of society, and then another ripple that has an impact on how policies develop for the society and what's done. But in a contained society or community, the ripples don't just go radiate out, but if they're strong enough, they start to radiate back in. So you start to have policy impacting values, impacting society, impacting community, impacting the workplace, impacting family and friends, impacting immediate family, and then impacting the individuals. We have this back and forth of impacts. But what's important to remember is that the further out the ripples go, the less likely the initial reason for the ripple is to be noticed. So somebody being traumatized and dropping that pebble in, you don't think about the impact that they're having on policy ultimately. And when the policy comes back to impact them, you don't think that the policy is related to their initial behaviors or what they're doing. So just an example of policy back in those days when there would have been a lot of violence against women, not that there isn't today, but in those days probably more blatant, that violence against women would have, although it could have been triggered by misogyny, it could have also been triggered by a partner trying to help the veteran deal with their trauma and the veteran raging back. And so you get family violence that of course then impacts all the way through and becomes a norm in society. So policies to help women to escape the violence aren't even developed because it's just considered normal behavior. Yeah, so and that's the point I'm just trying to make, is that we have these moments of trauma that ripple out and ripple out and ripple out. And the further out they go, the less likely we are to connect them to the trauma in the first place. That also goes over time. So as been pointed out in a number of presentations, the trauma both goes out in the immediate and it goes down through generations. So my children and my granddaughter would have no clue about, because I haven't talked to them about it, about the behavior of my father in the house, or the behavior of some of his colleagues and peers. They would have no clue of the impact it's had on their life today. We use the mention of pebbles, but there's also people drop rocks too. So the rocks are easier to see the long-term impact because the waves are bigger. But most of us, we're just pebbles. Our trauma are pebbles and they're not rocks. Some of us know where the trauma comes from, but most of us don't. The result is that, that trauma manifests itself as something that's normal and just part of society. So we have to work hard to look at the connections that are happening because of those pebbles that get thrown in the pond. Okay, that's it for mine. Thank you very much. There's a reference to the original article that we wrote about residential schools. Marv, are you coming back on?
Marv, are you coming back on?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. You're muted, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Are we going straight to questions, or do you have last words to wrap up?
The last word that I have is just to echo the strength of this team that came together almost a year and a half ago. We met up and we found that we have common purpose and are looking forward to our contributions that are working together that will eventuate in us hopefully being a part of the IAC 2022 conference, because this is a world issue. Thank you.
Okay, there's a question here. I know many Germans who are studying Hebrew language for themselves. Do you think that this fact may be a way to heal their guilt for their grandparents' actions in the war? So this question was by Pat. And I think it was about Germany. So it's addressed to Jürgen, I believe.
Okay. That's a good question. And there are very different possibilities in this case. Maybe learning Hebrew is something like a denial of concrete, detailed guilt connections. Or on the other hand, it's a wonderful means to get into contact with this Jewish culture and to realize, to learn so much about it, about a culture which has been fought against by the own ancestors. So you see, it's complex.
Okay.
And it's so important. Excuse me. It's so important for all of us, for clients and for counselors, to reflect ourselves, for our motivations, and to be in contact with each other, to ask, why do you do it? And to listen to the other side, and to be in a process. That's so important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Marvin, from looking at the whole of the presentations that everybody shared, and also, keeping in mind what Richard said, that war is not only a physical war. As counselors, as as people who are involved in NGOs, we are involved in many areas of life. From your whole research, what would be some of the takebacks that, where we can actually play a role to help prevent the violence?
I think maybe I'll refer this question to Richard. Do you have a comment on that? Because she's talking about prevention, and you're quite centrally involved in some of that, I believe.
Thank you. And it's a great question. I think one of the things that we are noticing through this work is the ability to find the humanity in each other. When we are able to return to that way of viewing the other, it's very very Emmanuel Levinasian in the thinking, where we see the other as an other and not as a thing, which is also very Martin Buber. When we are able to see our humanness with one another, because one of the things that both Marv and I we work on with moral injury or soul injury is after time passes, there is a return of what it means to be human. And those values and those beliefs, they seem to come back up. And then we question the thing that we did or the thing we were not able to do. And the return of our humanness allows us to connect with the thing or the person or what we have done. So I think in order to prevent that sort of negative arbitration of a war, it's to understand that we are all humans trying to endure and get through this life and do that all together, which is why that quote from Desjardins is so important. It's all together. We do it all together. And just to sort of dovetail on Jürgen's work, he ended with the word love. I think that's a concept that needs to be reintroduced into every culture to see the importance of it, because it's through love we're then able to understand and see our humanness.
Marv, it's Grant. Could I just add something in there?
Yes.
I think, Richard, that raises a really interesting point. I think as humans, we struggle to accept the other to begin with, whoever the other is. It is an ongoing struggle for all of us. But I think what is going to be harder for us to do is to accept the others as humans who are the ones that are perpetrating the abuse too. So to accept an SS officer as a human is a harder thing to do than to accept somebody who's been victimized by that SS officer. And I think before we get real change is we're going to have to figure that out. It's going to really take a rethinking of how we theorize and how we view other people.
Yeah, when I finished with love, it's not romantic love, it's not illusion of love and so, but it's just what Grant said. It's to see the other person and to see how the other person is different from me. And that's what my wife Ingeborg and me, we experience it every day. And it's so important to stand conflicts as well. And it's not romantic love, but this is a very great work we have to do, or so many people are just doing it, and we have to continue.
Very good. Thank you. And Anastasia, I just want to say, in addition to what Dave said, for counselors, the reason we're here, because many of us are counselors, what we couldn't present today are some of the approaches that we can teach best at an in-person conference with practice, because there are sensitivities around impact of trauma that I don't personally recommend one does that on Zoom or on the media format. But what you can do with the counselors listening today is think back to their training in group counseling. Nothing is more encouraging in our work to see bring people together in groups and looking for the common denominators of the humanity that both Jürgen and Richard have referred to this way, but use storytelling. If in the group of if you have groups of counselors and you have a structured storytelling process where people each talk about when they were young, how were they hurt? What happened to them growing up? What it does is they share commonalities of experiences they never thought others ever felt. So normalization and a group counseling, from my perspective, is a very, very promising approach. Look at what Jürgen and David did, what they brought the biggest group together I've seen, and I met some of them, and they brought them together, the descendants, in tremendous healing and rehabilitation of ancient trauma was achieved. And I met them. And that's, so I am, you can tell, I'm very biased, that I think what counselors can do more than psychotherapists and psychiatrists, some of them are so skilled in working with groups, because that's the safety of the human group. That's what I would add. And then I know David's on, and we each had a chance to speak to their question. Why don't you go, David?
I just couldn't agree more with you than what you've just said, Marv, and everybody has said. I thought it was a very interesting comment that Jürgen made about the nature of love as well. I think one of the things that concerns me within all of this is the numbers, really. I mean, I work with people at end of life, and so often they reach end of life without even realizing there's a trauma. They reach the end of life having felt guilty for something that, you know, in a relationship with a father or a mother, or, you know, that's been going on for 70, 80 years. I was with a lady a few years back who was 100, and she said, oh, I've never really thought about it before. She said, but in the 1920s, you know, my father would scream in the night and, you know, wet the bed, and my mother would run down the stairs and out of the house, but I would go in and cradle him like he was the baby and I was the mother. And she said, I think I was 6 or 7, just holding my father while he obviously had shell shock, you know. And I kind of think, so she'd never had any support or treatment, and she just, you know, that was something that she closed with just weeks before she died, you know. And I think I do really worry about that. There are a lot of people around who've never had any support for any of these things. The other thing I worry about, and I hate to say it, but it's nationalism. It's extreme forms of nationalism, and speaking from Britain, where someone will probably throw stones at me for what I'm about to say, but it's the danger of nostalgia, that we reinvent our history through rose-tinted spectacles, and that's why I think these meetings, these little meetings of families, of individuals, people coming face to face for small acts of love and reconciliation, are so important.
Yeah. Okay, we are almost hitting time, but I have one last question for the group, which I think is very important. In Malaysia, we have the Myanmar refugees. Luckily, we are not a war-torn country. In Africa, you have got states currently in war. So I'm going to ask a question from your research and from your learning. If you have a client in front of you, especially a young client, and you can see that that person has been traumatized by war. Now, I'm not asking for a it can be a technique, it can be a method, it can be a reach out. What would be the one way, each one of you, the most important thing you would do with that young person who has been affected by war? Well, I'd like everybody to answer that question. Just one thing, because of our time.
Okay. I was going to say, it's Marv Western again. We might add a 6th person. I think Dr. Buchanan does a lot of work with young children. We could bring her in to rescue us with this question as well, because that's an expertise of hers. But who wants to start with responding to that question?
It doesn't have to be a child. It can go up to teenager, right? You can go
okay.
up to
I don't mind going first. I think one of the things that I would do is create an environment where that person, first of all, feels safe enough to tell their story. If they have a safe environment where that story can be told and held with the highest of reverence, I think that will be one way for them to begin to not just dispel the difficult parts of the story, but having that environment of safety lets them know that the story in itself is sacred, and hold that space as a sacred space. So that's something that I would do.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next.
I can continue. I consent very much with Richard, and when he says it's a sacred space, that's so important. And not to think we have to and to work psychologically with so many tools. No, to be together with this person, to help to open a little bit of space like this, as you, I think, Anathuya, have said as well in your initial speech.
I'll go now. And it builds upon what's been said, but I think one of the things that trauma does to us, especially war, is it's a process of invalidation and dehumanization of the individual, where we're being told we don't matter. We're not human beings. And so I would focus on demonstrations of mattering. It builds to what's just been said. That's about building a safe environment. But there's small gestures, there's small human gestures that are important, I think. Providing a glass of water or a cup of tea, or having an office that you can see through the eyes of the clients rather than through your own comfort in that office. So what does it look like? And so that people are being welcomed into this environment in a very, very basic, primal human way.
Thank you.
I would just totally agree with my friends and colleagues and what they've said. I was just listening and thinking of a small thing that we've done. We've been working with Combat Stress, the military mental health charity in the UK, and some of our veterans have been working with secondary school children in London, but they happened to be working with them at the time of the pandemic, and actually the project has changed, and the veterans' stories are actually being used for the students to share their own stories of how the pandemic has impacted upon them and their families. So sometimes I think that maybe there's intergenerational ways of exchanging things which can be very beneficial.
Thank you.
And I'll just add one last thing. I really appreciate the comments and totally agree with all of them, is that when we're engaging with young clients who've come from conflict and war-torn countries and have trauma, is that we need to give them a sense of control, because their worlds were out of control. It was probably total chaos. So I think it's really important, oh, sorry about that, that we instill a slow process of you're in control, we'll go as slow as you need.
Thank you.
And I will now go. In Malaysia, or particularly now in China, we hear often about some hidden groups that are shunted away. And that happens in various parts of the world. It happened in our part as well. So to help counselors make contact, you do not bring people together and ask them about their experience, because that could be very threatening. And they could have been punished or killed for speaking about anything. So you don't do that. What you would do is this. You would inform yourself, study what you understand the experience is in these subgroups, what they've lived through, what kind of torture. And then what you could do is develop maybe a 10-point sheet that they just look at in their language together and simply say, I understand some of these things you may have seen or experienced. Don't speak about it, just indicate how many of these events did you personally encounter in your growing up in Wuhan or wherever you are. And then as Marla said, they are often terrified of contact because it's threatening, but they might say, hey, this person might understand where I come from and I don't have to say anything, but I just have to nod. Yes, that happened to my parents. They don't have to explain it and say, thank you. Now, if they would do this, are you ready in a group to hear from the others which ones they picked out? Or you could do it one-on-one. And this way you slowly build trust in the counselor, because they may see counselors as part of the state, as prosecutors in disguise. You have to go very, very carefully. And that's why, like, when my colleagues in Asia, when we work together, when I was in India, we must learn in the West how to approach people in culturally sensitive ways. And it's fine in some, but you must inform yourself first. And I think that's why I support counseling around the world so much, because as Jürgen said, it's not so complicated as psychiatry and psychotherapy. It's more normalized to have a counselor, at least in many countries. So I know I went on longer than I should, but really looking forward to meeting you all at the next in-person conference.
Yes.
And thank you for coordinating this.
Thank you. That was a very amazing sharing, and I think there's a lot to be learned there. That last bit was pretty mind-blowing and mind-boggling. I thank you all very much for this whole talk. All the speakers from IAC, from all over the world, for all the participants who are here from all over the world, for the Malaysians who've stayed up until 12:40 a.m. and my
Yes.
team, my small team of students who really supported Cheryl, Zuhair, and the rest of your team. You guys are wonderful. We could not have done this without you. It's a team of intern students who intern in IAC, and that's something else you all can look at if you all would like to do internship with IAC with your students. IAC is welcoming of interns. I'd like to thank Persatuan Counsellor Malaysia for their support as well. So thank you all very much for tonight. The videos, the recording of this session, as well as the slides will be up on the IAC website. Okay, but it's an NGO, so you've got to give us time to put it up. So please do understand, don't ask us tomorrow morning. It's not going to happen. It'll take a couple of days, but it will happen in a little bit of time. All right, I'd like to thank you all very much. I apologize if there were any technical errors, especially when my computer died halfway through and gave me stress and trauma. But thank God for other devices and friends. So thank you very much, and good night. Good night, good morning, good evening, good day. Okay, bye-bye. Adios, farewell. Auf Wiedersehen.
À la prochaine.
Selamat malam.